This is Ed Stewart. Ed is the curator at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. He knows a thing or two about real spaceships. But what does he know about the fictional variety and how they measure up to the real thing? This is Curator VX.
Where was I 25 years ago? I would have been watching it shortly after I graduated from college, within a year or two of graduating from college. But no, I was super excited for the prequels to come out. And I am one of the people that holds the unpopular opinion that I don't think the prequels were terrible. I very much enjoyed them, but in my brain, they made sense in a way as if the original trilogy was World War II, then the prequels were like pre-World War I and World War I Europe. And so that's kind of how it fits in my brain. And that's why you see everything's new and shiny and very Art Deco looking, and people are wearing these big elaborate costumes and clothing and all that sort of stuff. And so I, with a couple of caveats, really like the prequel trilogy. Oh, that's the Consular. It's not a yacht. It's a Consular cruiser, I think. Yeah, I mean, it seems like a really solid ship design. It borders on being military. It definitely has that idea of like government efficiency. It very much has that sort of same Corellian Corvette vibe to it. So it's definitely a predecessor there. It's a solid design from just I need to get people and stuff from here to there point of view. You got 3 nice engines and nacelles in the back. It's got a nice big dish on there for communications, which you would think you would have lots of if it's a consular ship. It seems to be well set up to kind of defend itself. It looks very armor plated, and I would say that's a very grounded sort of common sense design. Oh, the droid army. They're kind of like the equivalent of an aircraft carrier because they have all of the little droid fighters on board. And I think that's interesting because that's where you see it sort of moving out of this Art Deco look into a more industrial, very purpose-built, very spare, clearly not made for human inhabitation. They do have in the sphere there, that's where like the command center is. So there are the Neimoidians. So yeah, the Neimoidians kind of hang out there, and then kind of the horns that come off the side seem to be really almost dedicated purely towards the droid functionality and the deployment of the droid fighters and everything. So as a station, I could see it functioning pretty reasonably. Once you set it into an orbit, it could kind of hang out there and chill and not be a problem.
This. Oops.
If we want to talk Star Wars and reactor cores and single shots, there's the Death Star. But, you know, depending on how much energy is in your power source, I think it's entirely reasonable to think that you could destroy an entire ship.
Now this is pod racing.
And especially when you're talking about things that have enough energy in them to move these massive structures of metal and droids and all this other stuff at, you know, hyperspace speeds, that would require enormous amounts of energy. So destroying that in a way that releases that energy, I could absolutely see that happening. All right, now the droid fighters themselves. I've always thought these were very cool. If you look at them in the context of like unmanned aerial vehicles and drones and stuff, they make a lot of sense. You could have swarms of them doing whatever it is you need them to do. Those are also multifunction because they become little walkers as well, which there is no real world equivalent for that at the moment anyways. The closest thing really is like things like the Ospreys that go from helicopter mode to, you know, like airplane mode basically. I question the need for it to be able to transform and become a walker as well as being a fighter. That seems like a lot of extra complexity that you wouldn't necessarily want. But a good solid design, they definitely have the intimidation factor going. They remind me just a tiny bit of the Cylon fighters from Battlestar Galactica 2, just a touch. Especially from the original Battlestar series where the wings on the Cylon Raider ships would just pop out to the side. There's a little bit of that element with the nacelles / legs on these. Real world equivalents, you know, drones are kind of the realest thing that we have right now. that seem in that vein. Nowhere near as sort of independently operated or intelligent, at least not yet. But, great design. That's the troop transporter that deployed the battle droids, the B-1 battle droids, down onto the planet's surface.
Roger, roger.
That, to me, is one of the most unique designs in all of the prequel ships because it's very much a function first and then form. In terms of, they just keep the little B-1 battle droids folded up in their smallest form in these massive racks that just kind of turn through and drop things off, almost like something you would see in a factory. In terms of practical design, you've got these great big structures that may or may not be wings. So maybe you get a little aerodynamic resistance, and so they're helping their engines out as they come in through atmosphere. Oh, that's the Naboo Royal. Did they call it a yacht? Was it a Royal Yacht?
Ah, yes! Nubian! We have lots of that.
The Naboo ship designs are just gorgeous. They remind me a lot, like the propeller-powered fighters, especially with the ones that they just left polished aluminum and didn't cover with paint, has a lot of that vibe to it. Very much, again, in that sort of Art Deco feel. Naboo is an interesting thing because Naboo, all of their money comes from the plasma that they mine on the planet, which is apparently particularly pure or something. This is a very fictional version of plasma. So you can almost think of Naboo a little bit like the Middle East and oil production. So that's a big, huge energy source. In some ways, Naboo is a little bit like Dubai. It has all of this huge soaring architecture and very expensive vehicles and things like that. And the design of the ships, super aerodynamic, again, super kind of Art Deco-y, very sleek. They appear to be very aerodynamics driven or like fluid dynamics driven because of their small leading edges. Then they kind of become more fluid and sort of bulbous, and then they thin back out again. You don't see anything in the way of control surfaces on them, so, they're not really flying like you expect an airplane to fly. But, you put that thing in a wind tunnel, and it's going to be practically invisible in terms of how the wind is going to press against it. So the Naboo yacht also has a lot of sort of the SR-71 Blackbird and the A-12 aircraft in them, in the way that they have the central fuselage, but then it kind of comes out to these edges that are called chines. And in some ways, the engines that you see on the Naboo yacht are almost backwards from what the A-12s and the SR-71s have, because the A-12s and the SR-71s on their intakes have an adjustable cone that is made to kind of move in and out depending on your altitude, so that you can jam more air into your combustion chamber at a higher speed. And so the higher altitude you go, the farther out that cone would stick, so that it constricted the space in between the edge of the cone and the interior of the nacelle. So one thing that this ship and like the Naboo starfighter, the N1, have in common, which is a detail that I really like, is when you look at the trailing end or the back end of the engines, there's this big long spike that comes out. I don't know if this was done on purpose or if it was done as a stylistic thing. There is a rocket technology called the annular aerospike engine. And what the annular aerospike is imagine taking your traditional rocket engine with the nozzle and mathematically turning it inside out. So what was that surface around the outside edge of the nozzle is inverted and becomes this spike that's in the middle. And then you have your combustion that happens in a ring around that spike, sort of at the top part of the engine. And that is a way that has been kind of toyed with for a long time to try and make engines that are at peak efficiency no matter what altitude they're at. They've only been tested on the ground in test stands and things, so we haven't seen one fly on a true mission yet. So like right now, when you see a rocket engine, the size and shape and length of the bell is designed to kind of give you peak performance through a certain phase of flight, right? And in theory, a aerospike like that could allow you to have peak performance throughout the entire process of launch. So your engine performs differently at sea level versus at 1,000 feet versus at 10,000 feet because of the air pressure around it. And in theory, the aerospike engine allows the exhaust plume to kind of shape itself naturally with the ambient air pressure around it, allowing it to be as efficient as possible in every single moment of flight. And so whether that was done on purpose or not, that's definitely a very practical design in terms of it has a real world equivalent, but that little nod to sort of a real world thing, it's a very cool thing to see. Oh, the Sith Infiltrator? Yeah, so that was Darth Maul's ship, and there is nothing real world about that. It's sort of reminiscent of the TIE fighters, because it's got that sort of bulbous cockpit area, and it's got a really long beak, and then it has the curved, solar panel areas. Very intimidating looking. Definitely a form over function, in my opinion. You want it to look really mean and nasty, and then when a guy in black robes and head spikes comes out of it, that's totally on brand. I think if anything, it reminds me a little bit of, there's just a number of sort of fuselage forward concept aircraft that kind of mimic that shape a little bit, where your cockpit is kind of farther back and your wings are also farther back, and you've got sort of a long nose and fuselage in front. But that's the closest kind of real world thing that is out there. Okay, the pod racers. Man, the closest thing I can think of to a pod racer, they're like kind of half barnstormer and half destruction derby. They're cobbled together.
Ooh, there goes Quadranero's power coupling.
They're the biggest possible engine you could put on the smallest possible pod. We won't even talk about, little booby traps and weapon systems and the equivalent of like the James Bond caltrops. It's also a little bit chariot race too, kind of going back into that Star Wars, loving a little bit of Greek mythology and kind of Roman stuff. Definitely very chariot racy. Definitely has a lot of that car culture.
Hey, you're supposed to be the fastest thing in the valley, man, but that can't be your car. It must be your mama's car.
And chariot race, feel to it that adds a lot of excitement. Lucas, from a visual design standpoint, has been pretty open about where he pulls his influences from. And so even if you look at the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon, is definitely a riff on the cockpit from the Enola Gay, especially the pod racer that Anakin built.
It's working! It's working!
I mean, those are definitely jet engines. They've got the little knob and sort of the hub of the fan. You could pull almost any engine out of a fighter jet from the 70s to the mid 2000s. And they would look perfectly appropriate strapped to the front end of a pod racer, just because it's that same mechanical vibe, bringing in that military look and feel, totally on purpose. The N1 Starfighter. Super aerodynamic. It looks like you could drop it with the engines off and it would just fall in a perfectly straight line because the wind isn't going to see it. It looks also equally well suited to go underwater, which I don't recall ever seeing them go underwater. But given that Naboo also had a lot of water on its surface, and there were some weird relations between the Naboo royalty, above ground folks, and the Gungans, then maybe that was something that was a consideration. I don't know that for sure. But the N1, it is very kind of World War I, kind of World War II fighter kind of vibe to it. In particular, for some reason, it makes me think of the twin hull fighter, the T-38 Lightning. But the N1 is also, it has a little bit of the T-38 Talon in it, because it's small. It looks to be about as efficient as you can get in that design language. But it also, and this is probably influenced by watching Mandalorian, it also has that vibe of, this is a 1938 Phaeton that in 1938 was an expensive car, but then 40 years later, somebody's going to find one and they're going to build it out and turn it into a rat rod. It serves all of those roles, visually speaking, really, really well. Not a crazy outlandish design. It definitely feels more like it should be an in-atmosphere aircraft than a spacecraft, but obviously in the movies we see it do both. So if you had to pick a Star Wars fighter that was best suited to fly in atmosphere, it would probably be the N1. In the comments below, let us know what your favorite ship is. Let us know what other series and what other spacecraft you might like us to talk about, fictional or real. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can see what comes up next.